History remembers Anne Boleyn as the wife who lost her head, a footnote beneath her daughter's reign. But in truth, the night before her death was not a moment of resignation. It was a reckoning. Behind the tower's damp walls, England's most infamous queen confronted a silence more terrifying than any sword. The same silence she had once used to destroy others now whispered her own name. This is not the story written by courtiers or priests. It is the story history refused to tell. A queen stripped of her crown, a woman abandoned by the man who changed God's law for her, and a night when England held its breath as one soul awaited judgment. The rain had begun before dusk and had not stopped since. It pressed against the walls of the tower like a living thing, breathing cold into every crevice of Anne Boleyn's chamber. She sat upon the narrow bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the coarse linen of her gown rough against skin that had once been draped in silk. The crown, the jewels, the laughter of court, all seemed like a cruel play she had performed in another life. Now, only the echo of her own heartbeat reminded her she still lived. They had taken her title, her servants, even her dignity. Yet the one theft that wounded most was Henry's silence. She had begged, reasoned, prayed, but the king who once swore eternity had sent only absence. The silence of a monarch was more final than a decree. It meant the world had turned its face away. Anne looked to the narrow window. The sky was the color of old iron, and beyond it lay a kingdom that no longer belonged to her. She thought of her daughter, her small Elizabeth, red-haired and solemn. Somewhere beyond these stones, her child slept, unknowing that her mother awaited the sword at dawn. The thought burned hotter than fear. She whispered her daughter's name once, not to be heard, but to make it real in the suffocating quiet. The tower had seen countless deaths, but few like hers. She, the queen who unseated another woman, now sat where that same queen's lovers had once prayed for mercy. The irony was exquisite, as though the stones themselves remembered and took pleasure in returning the cruelty. She recalled the day Catherine of Aragon was sent away, the satisfaction she had felt watching the old queen's carriage vanish. Now she understood the look Catherine had given her, pity disguised as piety. A faint sound interrupted her thoughts, the slow drip of rain leaking through the ceiling, landing rhythmically on the floor. Each drop sounded like a countdown. Anne's breath trembled. The hours ahead would not be long, but they would be endless in their wait. Somewhere below, a bell tolled. Not for her, not yet, but its echo seeped upward through the stone like the voice of fate rehearsing its final call. She wondered if Henry would think of her at all when it sounded for real. Perhaps he would dine, surrounded by flatterers and musicians, while London whispered that the witch queen was gone. Her hands trembled, and she pressed them together until the knuckles turned white. She had been many things, a seductress, a reformer, a queen, but never powerless. Now stripped of all titles, she found herself only as a woman about to die, and the simplicity of that truth chilled her more than death itself. When the candle beside her guttered, the flame bent low and stuttered, its light drawing long trembling shadows across the wall. Anne closed her eyes. The silence around her deepened until even her heartbeat seemed a trespass. In that silence, she began to hear faint whispers, voices from her past, laughter in royal chambers, the cries of women condemned, the soft sob of her brother's wife. They came not to comfort, but to remind her. For the first time in her life, Anne Boleyn realized what true powerlessness sounded like. It was silence. The Tower of London did not sleep. Even in the stillness before dawn, it murmured. The walls exhaled moisture, the corridors hummed faintly with movement. Within its labyrinth of stone, every whisper belonged to someone unseen. A guard shifting his pike, a servant carrying water, a priest murmuring a half-hearted prayer. To Anne Boleyn, confined within her small chamber, those sounds felt alive. They crept beneath the door, wrapped around her like breath, and spoke of judgment. She had once visited this place as queen, accompanied by guards who bowed, courtiers who smiled too much, and ladies eager to please her. She had pitied the prisoners then, men who had defied her husband's will or crossed her ambition. They had trembled as she passed, unaware that the same walls would one day study her with equal curiosity. Now she was one of them. Every corridor that had echoed her triumphs now awaited the echo of her fall. At intervals, footsteps ascended the staircase. They would pause outside her door, perhaps listening, perhaps counting the hours, and then move away again. The tower breathed through them, as if testing her patience, reminding her that her life no longer belonged to her. She knew that beyond those walls, the machinery of execution was being prepared, scaffolds measured, straw spread to soak the blood, carpenters ordered to ensure the surface was smooth. England's justice demanded perfection even in death. Anne thought of Elizabeth again. She had begged permission to see her daughter, but the request was denied. "It is not fitting," they had told her. Fitting, the word stung worse than insult. To the men of power, motherhood was unfit for a condemned woman. Yet, she had carried that child through the dangers of Henry's favor, through court intrigue and envy, believing her love would protect them both. Now the world called her unclean, as though a mother's kiss could corrupt a child destined for greatness. A gust of wind forced the door to tremble in its hinges. The whispering deepened. Some said the tower was haunted, that the spirits of the executed roamed its halls seeking peace. Anne wondered if their presence could be so near. She thought of those who had gone before her, Thomas More, the Carthusian monks, the nameless men and women who had perished in the king's reform. The stones were heavy with their breath. Perhaps the tower was not a building at all, but a throat, swallowing one soul at a time until silence was all that remained. At night, the priest came again, though not to speak. He lingered outside the door, murmuring prayers for his own salvation more than hers. His Latin phrases fell like cold rain through the keyhole, and Anne listened with an odd calmness. She did not fear what awaited her. She feared being forgotten, that her name would fade into scandal and jest, her truth rewritten by those who had the power to erase. As the night wore on, the whispers grew into shapes. She imagined the tower's stones leaning close, repeating words she could barely understand. "Remember," they seemed to say. "You too, once condemned." Anne rose from the bed and placed her hand upon the wall. The stone was cold, slick with condensation, yet beneath the surface, it pulsed faintly, as though remembering every plea that had ever been made against it. The tower did not hate her. It simply waited. When dawn came again, the whispers ceased, leaving only stillness. It was the kind of silence that always comes before the breaking of a human soul. At Whitehall, the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. Candles burned low, their flames reflecting in the polished goblets set before the king. Henry VIII sat at the head of a long table, his shoulders broad beneath a tunic embroidered with gold thread. Around him, courtiers laughed too loudly, drank too quickly, and prayed silently that his eyes would not find them wanting. No one dared mention her name. The Queen, the condemned, had been erased from the present tense. A musician played a slow melody on the lute, the same song that Anne had once sung to Henry when love had been new and dangerous. The sound hung in the air like smoke. Henry's hand froze halfway to his cup. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, a memory, a ghost, and then it was gone. He turned to his plate and cut through the meat with mechanical precision. The court had learned long ago that a king's silence could kill faster than any sword. They filled the room with noise to drown it, speaking of hunting, of trade, of Spain. Yet beneath the talk, fear walked freely. The same nobles who had sworn loyalty to Anne now denounced her in whispers. It was not betrayal. It was survival. In Tudor England, loyalty was a luxury no one could afford for long. Henry had convinced himself of righteousness. He spoke of justice, of the law, of God's will. But the truth, known only to his conscience, was far more fragile. He needed her gone. The woman who had once been his rebellion had become his reminder that even kings could be enslaved by desire. Her wit had mocked him, her defiance had unsettled him, and worst of all, her body had failed to give him a son. Now to cleanse that humiliation, he cloaked vengeance in the garments of law. Across the hall, Thomas Cromwell observed the king carefully. He had orchestrated every piece of this spectacle, the accusations, the witnesses, the signed confessions extracted through terror. Cromwell's genius lay not in invention, but in precision. He built a story so perfect that it became truth by repetition. Henry needed only to believe what was most convenient. In that belief, Anne's death became an act of divine order, not cruelty. When the king finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost tender. "It is God's will," he murmured, though no one had asked him to speak. The courtiers bowed their heads. None dared remind him that it had once been God's will that he marry her. In the Tudor court, divine will was merely the echo of royal desire. Later, when the hall had emptied and only the dying firelight remained, Henry sat alone. The musician had gone. The plates were cleared. He stared into the flames, and for a fleeting second, he saw her face. Not the condemned woman of the tower, but the one who had laughed beside him in youth, her eyes bright with mischief. It was a vision he neither wanted nor could banish. He raised his hand as if to touch it, and the fire shifted, devouring her image completely. Outside, the night wind struck the palace walls, carrying faintly the bells of the tower. Henry turned his head, listening. Then, as if remembering himself, he rose and ordered more wine. The King of England did not drink to forget. He drank so that he would not remember. In another cell within the tower, a single candle flickered beside a sheet of parchment. Sir Thomas Wyatt, poet, diplomat, and once the king's favorite, leaned over the page as though the act of writing could keep him alive. His ink trembled with every breath. Outside, the ravens called. They always did before an execution. Wyatt had been imprisoned before, but this was different. This time, it was not treason that bound him, but memory. His quill hesitated above the page. The words that came were not meant for a king, nor for confession, but for a woman already condemned. "My lute, awake," he murmured, recalling the poem he had once written for her, when Anne Boleyn had been untouchable, radiant, and dangerous. In her certainty that the king's love would protect her from the storm. He had watched her rise, and now he would witness her fall. Wyatt had known her before Henry did, before ambition had sharpened her beauty into something lethal. He remembered her laughter, quick and bright as sunlight on armor, and the way she could turn affection into command with a glance. Yet he had also known her cruelty. She had smiled while others were destroyed in her name. Still, for all her sins, he could not bring himself to believe she deserved the fate awaiting her. In the corridors beyond his cell, the tower hummed with quiet purpose. Servants carried messages, guards changed their watch. Each movement was part of an invisible choreography, all leading toward one inevitable conclusion. The Queen must die, and history must call it justice. Wyatt knew that Cromwell had built the entire case like a poem. Every accusation rhymed perfectly with the king's insecurity. He pressed his palm against the cold stone. Somewhere nearby, the accused lovers, Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton, awaited their own ends. He pitied them, though some he had disliked in life. None of them had been Anne's lovers. All were merely chosen to fit the king's story. In Tudor politics, truth was not an obstacle, it was a casualty. The poet's eyes turned upward toward the narrow window slit. He could see only a sliver of sky, bruised with the color of coming dawn. Somewhere beneath that same sky, Anne sat alone. He imagined her fingers folded as they once had been during Mass, her lips whispering prayers to a God that had turned his face away. Wyatt dipped his quill again, writing faster now, the ink blurring with sweat. He wrote not to save her, no words could, but to leave a trace that she had once been loved, that not all men had turned against her. He wrote as though the act itself could defy the king's silence. When the candle burned low, he stopped. The tower had grown quieter, but the quiet was not peace. It was waiting. Footsteps echoed somewhere below. He thought he heard her name spoken, soft, reverent, final. Wyatt closed his eyes. He knew that he too might never leave this place alive. Yet he felt no fear, only an unbearable sorrow that history, so eager to remember kings, would forget the moments when love and power destroyed each other. He folded the page carefully and hid it within the stones of his cell. A poet's last defiance against a king's truth. As the candle died, Sir Thomas Wyatt whispered her name once more, not as subject, not as queen, but as the woman who had once made England tremble. Anne. In May of 1536, London became a theater. The actors were unwilling, the script already written, and the audience, the king's subjects, demanded blood disguised as truth. The trials of Anne's accused lovers began beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Hall. The great space, once built to echo law and reason, now amplified lies with perfect clarity. One by one, the men were brought forward: Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, each carrying the same expression, disbelief slowly curdling into horror. They knew before the charges were read that they had already been found guilty. The Crown's evidence was paper thin, dates that contradicted time, encounters that could not have happened, whispers turned into written proof. But the brilliance of Thomas Cromwell's design was that truth no longer mattered. What mattered was obedience to the king's grief and rage. The queen's fall had to appear lawful, moral, ordained. To question that illusion was to risk one's own head. Mark Smeaton, the musician, was the first to break. A boy of low birth. Easily frightened, he confessed after days of questioning, though no one dared call it torture. His words were shaped for him, his signature guided by another hand. Cromwell's agents ensured the story fit perfectly: the queen's vanity, her flirtations, her ambition to rule through men. Once Smeaton spoke, the rest was merely arrangement. Norris had been Henry's closest friend, yet friendship had no value against royal paranoia. Weston and Brereton, noble and proud, held their silence with dignity that only deepened the king's suspicion. By the time they stood before the peers of England, their fates were not on trial, only the king's conscience. The narrator of history would later call it a travesty, but to those present, it was theater at its most exquisite. The courtiers leaned forward to watch men defend themselves against words heavier than iron. The peers nodded solemnly, pretending the process was just. The scribes dipped their quills, recording verdicts they had known since morning. When the sentences were read, death by beheading for the nobles, hanging and quartering for Smeaton, the hall was silent. No protest rose, no plea for mercy. Those who had once toasted with these men now studied the floor, praying that the king's gaze would not find them next. In the tower, Anne was told of their fate. The messenger stammered as he spoke, unable to meet her eyes. She listened quietly, her hands folded, as though he were reciting scripture. When he finished, she whispered only, "Then I am near my end." There was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion, the kind that follows when even hope has been executed. That night, the city buzzed with rumor. In taverns and markets, Londoners spoke her name like a curse or a fascination. Some said she had bewitched the king, others that she was the punishment for his pride. None spoke of justice. Justice was for God. The king dealt only in consequence. Inside the tower, Anne lay awake, hearing the sound of hammers outside. Carpenters constructing the scaffold that would soon bear her. She wondered if they worked by moonlight or torch, if they spoke of her as they worked. Perhaps they did not speak at all. In a few days, their work would be complete. The Queen's lovers would die first, and England would applaud its own cruelty as virtue. In the cold stone halls of the Tower, even silence felt cruel. Anne's brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, was led through the gates with a face neither defiant nor broken, only hollow. Once one of the most elegant men of Henry's court, he now walked like a ghost rehearsing his own funeral. The charges against him were the most obscene of all, that he had committed incest with his sister, the Queen. It was not merely a lie. It was an instrument designed to annihilate her completely. To accuse a queen of adultery was to disgrace her. But to accuse her of incest was to erase her from the human world entirely. Thomas Cromwell's genius was not in creating evidence, but in knowing what horror people were willing to believe. Court gossip had long whispered about Anne's closeness to her brother, how she trusted him above all men, how they shared secrets no one else knew. Cromwell turned affection into corruption, loyalty into lust. A few twisted words, a few suggestive glances recalled from memory, and the king's will was satisfied. At his trial, George stood before the peers of England, elegant even in ruin. He was forced to read aloud the accusation that he had violated his own sister in the hopes of producing a royal heir. When he finished, he looked up and said calmly, "I believe that few men have been condemned for greater falsehood." His voice did not tremble, but the hall felt colder for it. Anne, locked away in her tower chamber, was not permitted to see him. Yet she heard the murmurs from her ladies, the whispers of what was said, what was imagined. When she was told of the charge, she laughed once, not from disbelief, but despair. "They would make me a monster to justify his sin," she said softly, meaning the king. The bond between the Boleyns had been unshakable. George had been her ally, her mirror, her protector in the labyrinth of court politics. Together they had risen, and now together they would fall. He had known too much of the Queen's heart, and perhaps of the king's cruelty. That was enough to damn him. On May 17, 1536, George and the other condemned men were brought to Tower Hill. It was morning, the sky pale and merciless. He mounted the scaffold with dignity, addressing the crowd with a composure that silenced even the guards. He confessed no crime, asked no forgiveness, and praised the king as loyalty demanded. Yet beneath his final words lingered a quiet defiance, a truth that would outlive the lies. His head fell cleanly, the executioner's blade swift. The crowd exhaled as though a spell had been broken. The brother was dead, and the sister was now truly alone. Inside the tower, Anne was told the moment it happened. She bowed her head, whispering a prayer no one could hear. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "He is fortunate. His suffering is over." That night, the rain came softly over London. The streets were slick with the day's silence. In her cell, Anne pressed her hand against the cold wall, as if she could feel her brother through the stone. For the first time, she did not cry. There was nothing left to lose, only the waiting, and the dread knowledge that she would follow him soon. In that waiting, history itself seemed to pause, suspended between accusation and execution, between love and oblivion. Midnight settled over the tower like a funeral cloth. The rain had stopped, but the air still trembled with the smell of damp stone and iron. Within her chamber, Anne Boleyn sat by a flickering candle, her hands folded not in prayer, but in reflection. The light trembled against her face, softening what the days of terror had carved into her. When the door creaked open, she did not turn. The priest stepped inside, his robe heavy with moisture, his breath shallow. He was young, too young to bear the weight of absolving a queen. His name was Father Kingston, and though he came as a servant of God, he looked more like a man condemned to share in her sorrow. "My lady," he whispered, kneeling before her, "it is time to make peace with your soul." Anne's eyes lifted slowly. "My soul," she murmured, "has been at war far longer than my flesh." The priest trembled as he opened his small book of prayers, but Anne stopped him with a gesture. "No, Father," she said. "Tonight I confess not to you, but to the silence that has followed me here." He hesitated, but she continued, her words calm and deliberate. "Once, I believed myself chosen, not by God, but by fate. I thought I could bend a king's heart to righteousness. But power, Father, power is a faithless lover. It leaves you cold, and when you reach for it again, it cuts you." Her voice was low, like the slow toll of a bell. She spoke not in guilt, but in remembrance of the laughter in Henry's eyes when he first called her my queen, of the warmth of her daughter's tiny hand, of the faces that now haunted her each time she closed her eyes. "I dream of a river," she said softly. "A red river beneath this tower. It runs endlessly, carrying away the names of those who have died for me, and those who will die because of me." The priest dared not speak. His pen scratched faintly as he wrote her words, but his eyes glistened. "Tell His Majesty," she said, her tone softening, "that I ask no forgiveness from him, only that he guard our daughter well. For she is the best part of both of us, though he will not see it now." Her gaze lifted toward the ceiling, as if she could see through it, past the tower, past the darkness, into a dawn that would never come for her. The priest's voice broke as he asked, "Do you fear death, my lady?" Anne smiled faintly. "No, Father. I fear being forgotten." The candle hissed, guttered, then flared again. For a moment, the chamber seemed brighter, a fragile defiance against the world beyond its walls. When she finally knelt to pray, the priest could not bring himself to touch her head in blessing. His hands shook too violently. "You are God's child," he whispered. Anne looked up at him, her eyes steady. "Then let him remember that when the sword falls." She rose, calm and dignified, as though preparing for a coronation rather than an execution. The priest watched her in silence, realizing that no sermon he would ever preach could match the quiet holiness of her composure. Later, when he sealed his written account, his ink smudged with tears, he paused to add one final line, not of doctrine, but of despair. "I have heard confession from a woman more saint than sinner, and I fear that history will absolve neither of us." He arrived in silence, a shadow crossing the gray waters of the channel. The man from Calais was no ordinary killer. He was known for his swiftness, his precision, his mercy, the kind of mercy only kings could afford to purchase. His name was never written in the records, only his profession, Le Bourreau du Calais. When the ship docked at the Thames, no fanfare awaited him. Only a royal courier, cloaked against the morning fog, handed him a sealed parchment marked with the Tudor rose. It contained his instructions, his payment, and a single line that chilled him more than the English cold. "The Queen is to die cleanly, and with no spectacle of suffering." The swordsman said nothing. He had heard such requests before, whispered promises that cruelty would be disguised as justice. But the eyes of those who ordered death were always the same, desperate to appear merciful while demanding precision and destruction. He was escorted through London at dawn. The city still slept, unaware that history's most infamous executioner walked its streets. The tower rose before him, vast and ancient, its walls glistening with rain. Inside, workers were already preparing the scaffold, sanding the planks, testing the block, and sweeping the stones as if to cleanse them of yesterday's ghosts. The swordsman watched in silence. He saw the stage upon which England's conscience would die. Each nail hammered into the wood sounded like the ticking of an unseen clock, counting down to a queen's final breath. In the courtyard, the lieutenant of the tower approached. "You understand," he said carefully. "There must be no hesitation. His Majesty will not tolerate spectacle." The Frenchman bowed. "I have never struck twice." Later, in the armory, he examined his weapon, a long curved blade from Toledo steel. He wiped it with oil until it caught the light like a thin crescent of moonlight. He murmured a brief prayer, not for the condemned, but for his own hand. for even a merciful death stains the soul of the one who delivers it. When he was led to his quarters, he asked to see the woman he was to kill. The request was refused. The queen, they said, was still at prayer. Yet the swordsman imagined her, not as a traitor or sinner, but as all the others he had ended, human, trembling, and undeserving of the pageant that awaited her. As night deepened, the tower's corridors echoed faintly with the sound of water dripping from the battlements. The swordsman sat alone, sharpening his blade one final time. Every pass of the stone whispered like breath against metal. He thought of the rumor that had reached Calais, that the king had once loved her more than life itself, that she had changed a faith and a nation. Now she was to die not by English hands, but by foreign steel, as if England could outsource its own guilt. When the knock finally came at his door, the messenger's voice was low and tired. "At dawn," he said. "She is ready." The swordsman nodded, wrapping his blade in linen as though it were something sacred. Before sleep, he whispered a final thought in his native tongue, a line that history would never record, but which the walls of the tower might still remember. "I will kill her gently." But there is no gentle way to end a queen. Outside, the moon vanished behind clouds. The courtyard lay still, waiting. Tomorrow, England would awaken to the sound of silence cut clean in half. Dawn came gray and indifferent, like a sky that refused to mourn. The first sound was not the toll of a bell, but the soft murmur of guards changing watch. The tower was awake, though no one spoke her name. In her chamber, Anne Boleyn stood before a small mirror. Her hands were steady as she fastened the linen beneath her throat, smoothing each fold with ritual precision. She had chosen her gown carefully, a deep damask gray trimmed with crimson, the color of both royalty and ruin. There were no jewels, no crown, only a small cross of ivory that rested against her collarbone. Her ladies wept as they dressed her, but Anne's eyes remained dry. "Weep not for me," she told them softly, "for this world was never mine to keep." Outside, the morning mist crept through the courtyard like smoke from an invisible fire. The scaffold gleamed faintly with dew, the wood freshly sanded, a stage too clean for what it was meant to hold. Crows circled above the battlements, patient and watchful. The lieutenant of the tower entered, his expression formal, his posture rigid beneath the armor of duty. "My lady," he said, his voice catching slightly, "it is time." Anne inclined her head with the grace of one still accustomed to being obeyed. "Then let us not keep England waiting." They led her through the stone corridors she once walked as a queen. The same walls that had echoed with laughter now drank the hush of footsteps leading to her death. Servants bowed their heads, not from reverence, but from shame. When she stepped into the courtyard, the crowd fell silent. Nobles, soldiers, and commoners alike, all summoned to witness how swiftly power turns to dust. The French executioner waited, motionless beside his blade. Anne looked upon him and smiled faintly. "I hear you are very good," she said. Her voice did not tremble. The swordsman bowed once, unable to meet her gaze. Before mounting the scaffold, Anne turned toward the small chapel nearby. "Jesu, receive my soul," she whispered, crossing herself once. Then she ascended the wooden steps, each creak of the board beneath her feet sounding like the measure of time itself. At the top, she faced the crowd. The wind lifted her hair gently, and for a moment, the morning seemed to hold its breath. "I am come here to die," she began, her tone calm, resolute. "According to the law, and by the law I am judged to die. I do not accuse any man, nor the king my husband. I pray God save him, for he is a gentle and sovereign Lord." Her words drifted through the air, neither plea nor performance, but the strange serenity of one who has nothing left to lose. Even the guards seemed to shift uneasily, as though her dignity had turned the scaffold into a throne. When she knelt, one of her ladies stepped forward and tied a blindfold of white silk over her eyes. Anne's lips moved in silent prayer. The Frenchman took his place, his boots whispering against the planks. A laugh, soft, brittle, escaped her lips. "Is this still the morning?" she asked quietly. No one answered. The crowd bowed their heads. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and iron. And then, a silence so complete that it seemed the entire kingdom waited in its hold. There are moments when time does not move forward, it only folds. The moment Anne knelt upon the scaffold, the Tower of London seemed to hold its breath. 1,000 eyes watched, yet no one truly saw. The morning light, thin and colorless, rested upon her shoulders like the faintest mockery of a halo. The French executioner took one slow step forward. His blade, polished to a mirror's edge, reflected her stillness rather than his own. He had killed before, many times, but never like this. Never before a crowd that came not to see justice, but to silence a ghost still breathing. Anne's lips moved beneath the blindfold. "To Jesus Christ," she whispered, "I commend my soul." The sound of her voice, steady, clear, broke something invisible in the air. A gull cried over the river. The wind caught her hair and lifted it gently from her neck. The swordsman turned his head slightly and said softly, "Bring me my sword." It was a signal, a small act of mercy, meant to draw her attention away from the coming strike. She turned instinctively, her blindfold trembling with breath. In that heartbeat of distraction, he moved. The sound came not as a roar, but as a sigh, a swift whisper of steel through morning air. A single stroke. Perfect, merciless, final. Her body collapsed before the echo reached the walls. The head fell softly beside it, the blindfold still intact. There was no scream, no stumble, no second blow. For a moment, no one moved. Even the crows above were silent. The lieutenant crossed himself. A few women fainted. Somewhere a child began to sob. Then the sound returned. Boots shuffling, whispers, the heavy exhale of the crowd as though they had all been holding their breath. The swordsman stepped back, his eyes fixed on nothing. He bowed once, then turned away, leaving the bloodied planks behind him. His task was done. Anne's ladies rushed forward. They knelt beside her, their sobs muffled in their sleeves as they gathered her remains with trembling hands. There was no coffin, only an old elm chest, one that had once carried arrows for the tower guard. Into it, they placed her body, her head, her cross, her blindfold still damp with her final breath. No hymn was sung. No bell tolled. The earth received her without ceremony. From the palace, no messenger came. Henry dined that afternoon as though the world had not shifted beneath him. He asked, almost casually, "Is it done?" The answer came simply, "It is done, Your Majesty." And so ended the reign of Anne Boleyn, not with rebellion or lament, but with the quiet efficiency of power closing its own wound. That evening, the Tower courtyard was washed clean. The blood disappeared beneath water and straw, as if England itself were eager to forget. But the scent lingered, metallic, sorrowful, in the cracks between stones. Some said that, for nights afterward, a woman's figure was seen walking the scaffold, her hair loose, her head bowed, her steps soundless. Others said the crows would not perch there again. But history remembers not the superstition, only the silence. The silence that fell after the blade, the silence that England mistook for peace. The palace garden was quiet that morning. The child played alone among the rosebush, her laughter soft, uncertain, the kind of laughter that did not yet know loss. A nurse watched from a distance, her eyes shadowed with pity. The king had forbidden anyone to speak the queen's name in the child's presence. But silence, as always, found its own language. Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old. She did not understand why her mother no longer came to her, why her cradle no longer carried the faint scent of jasmine and ink. Yet, sometimes she would look toward the window when the wind stirred the curtains and whisper, "Mama?" as if the air might answer. The court had already moved on. A new queen awaited coronation. Musicians rehearsed new anthems, and servants replaced the old banners as though the color of mourning could be washed away with gold. But in the nursery, the ghosts lingered. Anne's belongings, a small prayer book, a ribbon, a lock of hair, had been hidden away, quietly preserved by those who could not bear to destroy them. Each item carried a trace of her presence, faint but unyielding, like perfume long after the wearer is gone. Elizabeth's governess, Lady Bryan, sometimes caught the girl staring at the small mirror that had once belonged to Anne. "Who do you see, my lady?" she asked gently. Elizabeth tilted her head, her reflection framed by light. "A lady who looks sad," she said. Outside, London pretended to forget. The river carried away rumors like silt, of innocence, of betrayal, of a queen who died with laughter on her lips. Yet, among the people, whispers persisted. The witch is gone. The king is free. But others, quieter, braver, said something else. She died too calm to be guilty. Years passed and the red-haired child grew into a young woman. Tutors filled her days with Latin, scripture, and diplomacy. But in the quiet moments between lessons, she would ask questions that no one dared to answer. "Did my mother love the king?" she once asked her guardian. "Did she deserve to die?" The answer came not in words, but in the trembling of hands too fearful to speak treason. Elizabeth learned then what every monarch must, that truth in England was a luxury paid for in blood. At night, she dreamed of a woman standing beside a river, her gown rippling like smoke, her face hidden in light. When Elizabeth reached for her, the woman would only whisper, "Remember me when they kneel." When she finally became queen, decades later, she wore no crown with joy. Her coronation robe shimmered with gold, yet beneath the fabric, the ghost of her mother's scaffold still breathed. Those who watched her said she ruled with iron will, unyielding, alone, untouchable. But those who listened closely heard something else, a voice beneath her voice, a memory that ruled beside her. Anne Boleyn had been erased from court, but not from blood. Every decree, every act of defiance, every moment Elizabeth stood unbroken before her enemies, all of it was an echo. The echo of a mother who refused to bow, even before the sword. And though history would write that England's greatest monarch was born of divine right, those who remembered knew the truth. Her power was not born in coronation, but in execution. The child of the dead had inherited more than a throne. She had inherited her mother's silence and turned it into a crown.